I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to me.
King Charles has just left Prince Harry a final gift, and it's nothing anyone expected. No titles, no treasure, but something far more shocking. A handwritten journal filled with personal confessions, regret, and pages of emotional truth about Diana, the monarchy, and fatherhood. Palace insiders say it left mouths open. Why this gift? Why now? And what exactly did Charles write that brought Harry to tears? Could this be an olive branch or a quiet goodbye? Stay with us, because this diary might be the most powerful thing the king has ever handed down, and it changes everything. The gift no one saw coming. No crown, no title, no estate. When King Charles finalized his estate plan, royal aides expected the usual: art, jewels, ancestral lands. Each child would receive their due. Prince William, the heir, would take on the lion's share: castles, collections, ceremonial roles. Princess Anne, ever the steady hand, would be entrusted with historic heirlooms, symbols of the family's endurance. But when it came to Prince Harry, Charles did something no one anticipated. He gave him a journal, a small, weathered, leather-bound volume. Not gilded, not ceremonial, just worn and personal. Inside were pages upon pages of handwriting, King Charles's own words, written in the margins of grief and guilt, dating back to 1997, the year Diana died. Palace aides reportedly exchanged stunned looks. One whispered, "This isn't protocol." Another, closer to the family, said, "This left mouths open." For a man who felt abandoned by the firm, the institution that shaped and scarred him, this wasn't just an unusual inheritance, it was an emotional rupture. Why would a monarch hand over something so intimate, so raw, and so potentially explosive? That's what everyone at the palace wanted to know. And yet, Charles did it anyway. There was no ceremony, no cameras, just a private courier, a sealed box, and one name scrawled across the top: "To my son." No titles, no formalities, just a father's final attempt to reach the child who had walked away. But what was inside that journal would do more than stir emotion. It would challenge history, because this wasn't just a gift, it was a confession. The journal, written in grief, page after page, Harry discovered something he never expected to see from his father: vulnerability. The earliest entries were jagged, rushed, almost illegible. They began just days after Diana's death. Charles didn't write them as a king in waiting, but as a man drowning in guilt. "I failed your mother. I feared I'd fail you too." That sentence appeared twice. What followed were passages filled with shame, fear, and helplessness. Charles wrote of not knowing how to comfort his sons, of being torn between public obligation and private grief, of waking in the night, haunted by Diana's voice and wondering if she'd ever forgive him. He didn't spare himself. He wrote about his own flaws, his coldness, his formality, his fear of being too emotional. He questioned if the monarchy itself had swallowed his humanity. But the pages on Harry were the most revealing. He described a boy who smiled through pain, who acted out not for attention, but from confusion. A son who clung to his mother's memory while being pushed toward a future he never wanted. "I saw it in his eyes," Charles wrote. "The same storm I carried, but without the armor." There were no edits, no curated phrases. It wasn't polished for the press. It was poured out like a father desperately trying to be understood. And with every entry, one thing became clearer. Charles wasn't just giving Harry a journal. He was handing him the one truth he never spoke aloud. Now, it was Harry's turn to read. But what would he do with the pain pressed into those pages? That answer came next, in silence and in tears. Harry's reaction behind closed doors. The moment Harry opened the journal, something shifted. According to one palace insider, Harry received the sealed package with confusion. It was unexpected. No briefing, no legal memo, No instructions, just a courier, a signature, and silence. When he realized what it was, he reportedly excused himself and went straight to his private library. Meghan, curious, followed a few minutes later, only to find him sitting alone, surrounded by scattered pages, his hands trembling. He was reading aloud, not for drama, but because the words shook him so deeply he had to hear them out loud to believe they were real. "I feared I'd fail you too," he whispered, the tears coming freely. It wasn't rage, it wasn't relief. It was something far heavier, shock. For years, Harry had accused his father of emotional neglect, of choosing duty over parenthood, of failing to protect him from a life that chewed him up. Now, in his hands, were the unfiltered thoughts of a man who had, in many ways, confirmed those fears, but also revealed he had suffered just as deeply. Palace sources say Harry barely spoke for hours after finishing the journal. One aide described him as staring into the fire like he was seeing his childhood from the outside for the first time. He didn't call anyone. He didn't send a message to Charles. He just sat. And when Meghan returned later, sources say she simply knelt beside him and said, "He gave you what words could never say." This wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a wound reopened, with a chance, maybe, to finally heal. The real surprise, though, was what Meghan said next, and how it changed everything. Meghan's role in the aftermath. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for context. Meghan Markle reportedly listened in silence as Harry read passages to her, some softly, some in disbelief. She didn't offer judgment. She offered clarity. "Maybe," she said gently, "this is the first true apology." For Meghan, who has long been portrayed as the one pulling Harry away from the royal fold, this moment could have reopened old resentment. Instead, it reportedly opened a door. Palace insiders suggest Meghan encouraged Harry not to view the journal as manipulation, but as an olive branch, clumsy, flawed, but real. She even suggested something few expected: write back. Not to publish, not for the press, but for closure. Sources close to the Sussexes say Meghan helped Harry draft a personal letter in response, one that neither confirms forgiveness nor shuts the door. A letter that says, "I hear you, I'm still hurt, but I see you now too." It was the first time since their royal exit that Meghan spoke positively about Charles in private, calling the journal more than a gift. It's a release. And just like that, the narrative shifted. For years, Meghan was seen as the wedge between father and son. Now, she may have become the bridge. But while Harry was processing the past, the palace was scrambling to handle the future. Because the journal wasn't just emotional, it was dangerous. And when its existence leaked, the monarchy knew it had lost control of the story. A PR earthquake. In every royal crisis, the golden rule is silence. But silence doesn't mean calm. And inside the palace, there was anything but. The leak hit without warning. A single headline: Charles's secret journal gifted to Harry. No context, no quotes, just a whisper of truth and a tidal wave of speculation. Within hours, palace PR teams were on high alert. Meetings called, phones buzzing, advisors scrambling to figure out how something so private could have slipped through their ironclad grip. The gift hadn't gone through official estate protocol. It wasn't filed, catalogued, or approved by any royal secretary. Even senior aides didn't know it existed until Harry received it. One source described it bluntly. It wasn't a gift, it was a grenade. Some inside the firm were furious. They feared the contents would spark a renewed focus on Diana's death, on Charles's emotional failings, on the fragile public image they've worked decades to repair. Others, however, called it a masterstroke of emotional diplomacy, a deeply human act from a man often accused of being anything but. But the biggest question now wasn't about damage control, it was about trust. If the king could send something so personal, so raw, to a son who had publicly criticized him, what else was waiting to be revealed? And more importantly, what else did Harry now hold in his hands? The journal wasn't just a record of grief. It was a mirror to the monarchy's most vulnerable truths, and the pages inside weren't finished telling their story. heartbreaking revelations. The journal wasn't a royal biography. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't written to be read. And that's exactly what made it devastating. These pages weren't filtered through publicists or shaped for history. They were confessions from a man who, for all his power, had never truly known peace. And for the son, who had spent years feeling unwanted, unseen, and misunderstood, reading those words was like stepping into a world he thought didn't exist. In one entry, Charles described watching Diana collapse into tears after yet another tabloid storm. "I stood in the doorway. I didn't go to her. I didn't know how." He blamed himself for his coldness, for the pressure, for not protecting her, and even more, for not protecting their boys. In another, dated months after Diana's death, he wrote of William and Harry playing in the garden while he watched from inside, feeling paralyzed. "I knew they needed comfort, but I feared I was too broken to give it." And when it came to Harry, the words cut deepest. Charles wrote of how Harry's anger terrified him, not because it was disobedient, but because it was familiar. He raged like Diana, loved like her too, and I feared I'd lose him the same way. There were entries about missed birthdays, about moments when he considered resigning from royal life, about conversations with aides where he was told to keep the line steady and not let emotion interfere. He admitted that he sometimes dreamt of running away with his sons to Scotland, to live in peace, without photographers or protocol. He never did, and through it all, one phrase kept returning: "I wanted to be better. I didn't know how." For Harry, who had built walls of resentment and self-preservation, these were the words he never thought he'd hear. Not in a speech, not in a documentary, and certainly not in handwriting that trembled with pain. But those revelations didn't end with Harry, because one entry was marked by a different name, and it would soon pull William into the heart of the storm. William and Anne's reaction. The journal may have been gifted to Harry, but it didn't take long for word to spread through the family. William and Anne were both reportedly blindsided. Neither had been informed in advance, neither knew the journal existed, and neither had received anything close to that level of emotional transparency from Charles, at least not in writing. William's reaction, according to one source, was quiet. He said only it was his to give. But privately, insiders say he was deeply unsettled, not because of what was shared, but because of what it might mean. If the public discovered that Harry, not the heir, was given the most intimate piece of Charles's soul, how would that reshape the perception of royal legacy? Then there was Anne, straightforward, stoic, the palace's most consistent figure. Her reaction was far less diplomatic. "That's personal fire," she reportedly told aides. "Don't play with it." She wasn't referring to Harry, she was referring to Charles, who, in one private act of vulnerability, had opened a door that could never be closed. If Harry chose to share the journal, or worse, publish it, the monarchy would face emotional exposure like never before. But there was another problem. One section of the journal was addressed not to Harry, but to William, and it contained a message that no one saw coming. A plea, a warning, a father's dying wish, a family still divided. The journal was powerful, emotional, human, but it wasn't a solution. Despite the impact it had on Harry, the public distance between him and the royal family remained. There were no surprise visits, no calls from Buckingham Palace, no photographs of reunion, no olive branches extended beyond the pages. Harry still holds no royal patronages. His military titles remain revoked. His children, Archie and Lilibet, still do not carry HRH status. And King Charles, despite the emotional weight of the journal, has yet to publicly acknowledge it exists. For those hoping this was the start of reconciliation, the silence said otherwise. One insider called it a whisper of peace wrapped in a closed door. Because while the words were real, the walls remained. Royal protocol, image management, centuries of tradition, they don't shift overnight. And if Charles intended this journal to open the floodgates, he underestimated the force of the dam. Even within the family, tensions simmered. William, who had once called Harry the only one who understood their childhood, reportedly declined to comment when asked by aides if he'd respond to the journal entry written to him. Anne, loyal to duty above all else, reminded senior staff that feelings don't run the firm. Behind smiles at engagements and polished statements, the monarchy remains fractured, not by scandal, not by titles, but by something harder to mend: emotion. But inside the journal was a line that still lingers, addressed directly to William. And it just might be the one entry that holds the key to whatever happens next. A message for the future. King. It wasn't long, just a page. But what it said shifted the weight of the entire journal. Charles had written directly to William. Forgive him. 2 words that opened a storm of meaning. He continued, "You will rule. You must lead, but never lead with coldness. If you lose your brother, the crown will mean less. Not to the world, to you." It was raw, direct, and deeply unlike the usual tone between monarch and heir. Charles didn't write to William as a king speaking to a prince. He wrote as a father pleading with a son. He described how he had spent years trying to hold the institution together, and in doing so he had broken something far more fragile: family. He warned that the pressures of duty, if left unchecked, would devour empathy, that the throne must be built not just on protocol, but on compassion. He told William, "If you don't protect Harry, you'll become me, and that is a fate I wouldn't wish for you." For William, the words were a mirror, a chance to see himself not just as a leader, but as a brother, a father, a man. But what would he do with them? That remains unclear. He hasn't responded to Harry, not yet. He hasn't spoken of the journal publicly, and insiders say he remains internally conflicted, because the burden of the crown is heavy, and now Charles has passed it to him, along with the emotional debt he never repaid. Which brings us to the legacy. Because this gift wasn't gold or silver, it was truth, and it may change how we remember this king forever. A legacy gift. Unlike any other, royal gifts are usually grand. Jewels passed through dynasties, scepters, portraits, military swords, symbolic power carved in gold. But King Charles didn't follow tradition. He gave his son something far more valuable and far more volatile: a diary full of regret, sorrow, and things never said. Historians are calling it one of the most personal artifacts ever passed between monarch and child. Some are comparing it to Edward VIII's abdication letter, emotional, historic, and brimming with private torment. Archivists have quietly begun urging Harry to preserve it, not just as family memory, but as a royal record, a glimpse into the mind of a king not seen in speeches, but in solitude. Yet Harry hasn't decided. Some insiders say he's torn. Part of him wants to guard the journal fiercely, as a final conversation with a father he never truly had. Another part wonders if sharing it might finally show the world who Charles really was beneath the crown. Because in these pages, Charles didn't act like a monarch. He acted like a man, flawed, frightened, and full of feeling. And for a monarchy that often hides behind protocol, that may be the most powerful legacy he could have left. But legacy is only half the story, because while the journal may close, the world is still reacting, and what's being said beyond the gates of Windsor might shape what comes next. Tears and theories. Once the leak happened, the world didn't wait. The news that King Charles had given Prince Harry a personal, handwritten journal from the aftermath of Diana's death sent shockwaves across media, podcasts, newsrooms, and dinner tables. It wasn't just a royal headline, it was an emotional reckoning. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags like #CharlesJournal and #ForgiveHim started trending within hours. Comments ranged from heartbreak to suspicion. Thousands praised the king for finally showing vulnerability, something the monarchy rarely allows. Others weren't so sure. "Is this guilt or manipulation?" asked one viral tweet. "A weaponized apology," said another. And yet, countless users simply responded with, "This made me cry." For many, it was the first time Charles felt human. Public sympathy for Harry also surged. People remembered his grief-stricken face behind Diana's coffin. They remembered his confession in interviews of not feeling protected, of being told to keep calm and carry on while breaking inside. And now, knowing that his father was feeling something all along, but never said it, brought the pain full circle. Some royal commentators applauded the journal as a sign that the monarchy was evolving. They called it a moment of deep humanity in an institution built on silence. Others, especially more traditional analysts, warned that the emotional transparency could backfire. If the monarchy starts running on tears instead of tradition, said one critic, how long before it loses all mystique? Still, many asked the one question that matters most. What now? Would Harry finally forgive his father? Would Charles address the journal publicly? And, most urgently, would this change anything at all? Because while public opinion was shifting, the monarchy itself remained characteristically mute. No statement, no clarification, no denial, just silence, and a nation waiting for a royal heartbeat. Parliament watches quietly. What began as an emotional gift has now drifted into political waters. It didn't take long for Parliament to take notice. Not officially, not yet. But beneath the surface, in hallways and offices, the conversations had already begun. A few MPs, particularly those in favor of greater royal transparency, started to ask subtle but serious questions. Is it acceptable for a reigning monarch to privately express regret over national events while remaining silent in public? Some wondered if the journal could be considered a state document, given its references to Diana's death, royal protocols, and succession. Others dismissed that concern, citing it as a private heirloom. Still, the buzz grew louder. Could this be precedent-setting? If the king shares personal reflections tied to constitutional duty, does that open the door for public inquiry? Could a diary be used as evidence in future debates about royal behavior? Could it one day influence policies tied to royal funding, roles, or even succession? It's not about the ink on the pages. It's about what that ink represents. For decades, the monarchy has stood as both symbol and silence. The journal, emotional, intimate, conflicted, chips away at that silence. It introduces feeling into a role meant to rise above it. Now Parliament is watching, not out of malice, but out of awareness. Because the journal revealed a monarch who, privately, wrestled with decisions that shaped a generation and failed to speak them aloud until now. If more writings exist, or if Harry decides to publish, it could shift not just hearts, but laws. What started as a final gift may become a constitutional conversation. And yet, for Harry, one question still matters more than all the others. Olive branch or goodbye? Was it an act of peace or a father's last goodbye? As the dust begins to settle, that's the question everyone is still asking. Not just the public, not just historians, but Harry himself. Was the journal an invitation to reconcile, or a quiet farewell, the only way King Charles could say what he never managed in person? According to those close to Harry, he still hasn't reached out directly. He's reading and rereading the journal, sometimes late at night. Meghan has been supportive, but careful. There's no rush, no pressure, just space. Because healing doesn't happen on royal timelines, and while some hope Harry will fly to London, will walk through the gates of Clarence House, journal in hand, it hasn't happened yet. Some insiders believe it never will. Because even a handwritten confession doesn't erase years of silence. Even truth, when it arrives late, doesn't always fix what time has unraveled. Sometimes it just explains it. But here's what we do know. The journal changed something. It opened a window. It cracked the wall. It brought emotion to a palace built on restraint. And it left behind a simple human truth that even kings can regret. That fathers, no matter how royal, sometimes say too little, too late. As for Harry, he may respond. He may not. He may write back. He may speak aloud. Or he may simply keep the journal, unread by the world, tucked away like a letter that never needed to be answered. But whether it leads to reunion or remains a solitary gesture, one thing is clear. This wasn't just a royal gift. It was a page turned. And whatever happens next, the monarchy will never be able to say it didn't know how Harry felt or how Charles did. The diary closes, but the story, like all great royal sagas, is far from over. One journal, a father's truth, a son's silence. What happens next? Only time will tell. But this final gift has already rewritten the rules of royal legacy. If you found this story as moving as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you.